Welcome back, everybody. Today, we're going to do a deep dive on Japan Airlines and their business performance, looking at their 2024 integrated report.
All right. Sounds good.
Yeah, so we'll take a look at their different business segments and kind of see what's really driving the numbers in their financials.
Okay.
We'll look at their shareholder value plans, dividends and buybacks and that kind of thing. And I'm really curious to hear your take on their overall strategy
Okay.
and whether or not they think they could actually hit this ambitious 10% EBIT margin that they're looking at for 2030.
Yeah. Sounds good. I think it should be fun to dig into the numbers.
Yeah, okay, so the report breaks down Japan Airlines business into four main segments. They've got the full service carrier, which is, both domestic and international. They've got the low cost carrier, cargo and mail. And then this really interesting segment called mileage, lifestyle, and infrastructure. And what struck me is how they're really using these segments to kind of position themselves for the future of aviation, like not just as an airline, but almost as a tech company too.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think the way that they're integrating these segments is really key to their growth strategy. If you take, for example, their full service carrier segment,
Yeah.
they're not just relying on the post-pandemic travel rebound. They're actually using their new Airbus A350-1000s to launch this Airlines for the Future concept,
Interesting.
which really focuses on delivering personalized travel experiences. It
Okay.
seems like they're really trying to capture that more premium market. And I think that's especially telling given that outbound travel from Japan is recovering more slowly due to the weak yen.
Yeah, that's really interesting, that it's a double-edged sword with that week yen. Right. They're benefiting from all these tourists coming to Japan,
Right.
but they're also having to get creative to encourage Japanese travelers to fly out. Do you think this Airlines for the Future concept is the right strategy to counter that, with its emphasis on personalized experiences and all that?
It's certainly a way to differentiate themselves in a crowded market. I think, focusing on higher value customers who are potentially a bit less price sensitive could help offset the impact of the weak yen on that outbound demand.
Yeah, it's kind of like offering a boutique hotel experience in the sky instead of just, getting people from point A to point B.
Yeah, exactly. They're trying to create that whole experience that goes beyond just the flight itself.
Right. Okay. So let's move on to their low-cost carrier segment. They've got a few different brands playing in this space. Zipier, Spring Japan, and then Jetstar Japan, which is an equity affiliate.
Okay.
It's interesting to see how they're each kind of targeting slightly different niches within that budget travel market.
Yeah, and I think what's really fascinating is how they're using Zapier specifically to kind of spearhead their international expansion in the LCC segment.
Okay.
They've got these new routes to San Francisco, Manila, Vancouver, showing that they're really going after those long-haul, cost-conscious travelers,
Makes sense.
especially given that overall outbound demand is still relatively sluggish.
Right. So they're using the LCCs to tap into new markets, maybe where the price sensitivity is a little bit higher, and
Yeah.
using their FSC for that premium experience.
Right, exactly. A classic two-pronged approach, I think, catering to both ends of the market spectrum.
Right.
But what really caught my eye was JL's decision to relaunch their own freighter business after 13 years.
Oh, wow.
I think this is a significant move, especially given the current economic landscape.
I was really surprised by that too.
Yeah,
And they're not just throwing, any old cargo on those planes. They're focusing on high value goods like pharmaceuticals, fresh produce, Japanese regional products.
yeah.
It seems like a very calculated strategy to capitalize on very specific trade flows and kind of capture those higher margins in the cargo market.
Absolutely. I think it's all about strategic positioning and differentiation they're tapping into, that made in Japan premium, leveraging their existing network in East Asia, where that e-commerce demand is booming, and focusing on those commodities that require that specialized handling and speed.
Yeah, it's like they're saying, hey, we're not just moving boxes, we're delivering a premium logistics experience, right?
Right.
All right, so let's talk about this fourth segment, this mileage, lifestyle, and infrastructure.
Okay.
This one really makes you think, is this still an airline?
Yeah.
They've got their mileage program, travel agency services, ground handling, and then, they're talking about drone logistics and eVTOL transportation networks.
Yeah, this is where I think their mobility innovator ambition really shines through. They're not just connecting cities with airplanes, they're building an entire ecosystem around the travel experience from the initial planning stages all the way to getting you to that remote island with the drone delivery.
Right. And that JAL-MAS initiative, which stands for Mobility as a Service,
Yeah.
is really central to this vision, right?
Absolutely. It's about integrating all these different modes of transport into a seamless experience. Imagine booking a trip where your flight, your train to the airport, even a drone delivery to your hotel are all coordinated through a single platform.
It does sound pretty futuristic,
Yeah.
but it also highlights the challenges they're facing. Developing these technologies, navigating regulations, ensuring safety, getting consumers on board, that's no small feat.
Yeah, it's definitely a high risk, high reward strategy, I think, but it really shows their commitment to shaping the future of travel. They're not just following the trends, they're trying to create them.
Yeah, they're trying to be the trendsetters.
Exactly. Yeah, it's a bold vision for sure, but let's see if their financials can back it up.
Right, because, all this innovation and expansion,
Mhm.
that doesn't come cheap.
Right.
So let's dig into the numbers and see if Japan Airlines can actually walk the walk, not just talk the talk.
All right, so let's start with the basics. Their profit or EBIT, earnings before interest and taxes, came in at 145.2 billion yen in fiscal year 2023. So this is obviously a key measure of a company's operating profitability, and it shows they're not just recovering from the pandemic, they're actually exceeding pre-pandemic levels.
Okay, that's impressive. But I always get a little lost in those really big numbers.
Yeah.
Can you break it down for me? Like, what does that actually mean for their business?
Sure. So think of EBIT as the profit that a company makes from its core operations before you take into account things like interest expenses and taxes.
Okay.
It really gives you a clear picture of how efficiently they're running their business. And in JAL's case, that 145.2 billion yen in EBIT, that indicates a pretty healthy level of profitability.
Got it. So they're making money, but, how much profit are they actually squeezing out of each yen that they bring in? Like, that's what really matters, right?
Exactly. That's where we look at the EBIT margin. It tells you what percentage of revenue is actually left as profit after they cover all those operating expenses. And JAL's EBIT margin for fiscal year 2023 was 8.8%.
Okay, so for every 100 yen they made in revenue, they kept 8.8 as profit.
You got it. And for the airline industry, where margins are notoriously thin, that's a pretty decent figure. Plus, they're aiming for a 10% or higher EBIT margin by fiscal year 2025.
Wow, that's ambitious. What are they doing to try to achieve that? Are they just like cutting costs left and right?
Well, cost management is definitely part of the equation. They implemented some really effective cost-cutting measures during the pandemic, and they've managed to maintain a lot of those efficiencies even as demand has picked back up. But it's not just about cutting costs, it's also about making strategic investments.
Like those fuel-efficient planes, like the Boeing 787s and the Airbus A350s.
Exactly. Investing in a modern fuel-efficient fleet really helps lower their operating costs in the long run, even if it requires a significant upfront investment.
Right.
And of course, the rebound in travel demand, particularly all that strong inbound tourism we were talking about earlier, that's playing a big role in boosting their revenue.
Okay, so it sounds like they're firing it on all cylinders right now. But let's shift gears a little bit and talk about what this means for, investors like you and me.
Okay.
What is JAL doing to actually create shareholder value and, make us all happy campers?
Well, first off, they're paying dividends. Their dividend payout ratio, which is the percentage of profits they distribute to shareholders, was a very solid 34.3% in fiscal year 2023. And they're projecting an increase to 35% for fiscal year 2024. So that's a really good sign that they're committed to rewarding their investors.
Yeah, a consistent and growing dividend is always a welcome sight.
Absolutely.
But what about share buybacks? Do they have any plans to repurchase their own stock, which can also boost shareholder value?
Yeah, so while the report doesn't give us any specifics on future buyback plans, JAL has used this strategy in recent years, so it's definitely something to keep an eye on.
Okay, so they're paying dividends, they've done buybacks in the past, and they're investing in all these really exciting new initiatives. But are these results sustainable? I mean, what are some of the potential risks or challenges that could, throw JAL off course?
Yeah, that's the million-dollar question, isn't it? And unfortunately, no crystal ball can predict the future with certainty. But we can look at some potential headwinds. The global economic outlook is a little bit uncertain right now, and any kind of slowdown could impact travel demand,
Right,
fuel prices. Those are always a wild card for airlines.
of course.
And the competition in the industry is fierce, especially from those low-cost carriers that are constantly putting pressure on fares.
Yeah, those budget airlines,
Mm-hmm.
they're like the scrappy upstarts trying to, disrupt the industry.
Right.
How do you think JAL stacks up against the competition?
Well, this report doesn't really dive into competitor analysis, but just based on their financials, JAL seems to be in a pretty good position, especially compared to a lot of airlines that are still struggling to recover from the pandemic. Their strong financial performance and their forward-looking strategy, it definitely gives them a competitive edge.
Okay, so they're profitable, they're rewarding shareholders, they seem to be well positioned to navigate that competitive landscape. But what about their longer term vision?
Now, that's where things get really interesting. We've seen how they're diversifying their business portfolio, embracing innovation, delivering strong financial performance. But can they maintain this momentum? And what are the biggest opportunities and challenges that they face moving forward?
Yeah, I'm all ears. Let's hear that expert assessment. Yeah. Okay, so as we wrap up our deep dive into Japan Airlines, what's the big picture here? What are your thoughts on their ability to kind of navigate this rapidly changing industry and keep that growth trajectory going?
Well, Japan Airlines is clearly not afraid to embrace these new technologies and business models.
Right.
Their investments in drone logistics, those eVTOL networks, the JL Maz platform, it really signals a commitment to shaping the future of travel, not just reacting to it. And if they can successfully execute this vision, it could really lead to, significant new revenue streams and solidify their position as a leader, in this whole mobility space.
Yeah, that does sound promising. But
Yeah.
like you said before, there are definitely challenges too, right?
Oh, absolutely. Developing and scaling these new technologies is going to require significant investments and expertise. They'll need to navigate regulatory hurdles, ensure safety and reliability, convince consumers to actually embrace these new modes of travel.
Right.
And they can't lose focus on their core airline business in the process. They need to keep optimizing their routes, improving that customer experience, managing costs effectively, all while facing competition from both, traditional airlines and those really agile, low-cost carriers.
Yeah, it's a lot to juggle.
Yeah.
It's like they're trying to fly a plane while simultaneously building a rocket ship.
Yeah, a very apt analogy, I think, but it also speaks to their ambition and willingness to really push the boundaries.
So all things considered, would you say Japan Airlines is a good investment?
Well, based on what we've seen in this report,
Yeah.
I would say they're a compelling company to watch. They've got a diverse business portfolio, strong financial performance, that commitment to shareholder value. These are all positive indicators. They're not just riding the wave of the post-pandemic travel recovery. They're actively shaping their own future. But as with any investment, there are always risks and uncertainties.
Right, no sure bets in the airline industry.
Exactly. The global economic climate, fuel prices, competition, all of those factors could impact their performance.
So I guess kind of a cautiously optimistic outlook.
I would say so. They definitely have the potential to deliver some solid returns, but it's really going to depend on their ability to execute this ambitious vision and navigate, all the inevitable turbulence along the way.
Well, that's it for today, listeners. Our deep dive into Japan Airlines is complete. We explored their different business segments, from that premium full-service carrier experience to their forays into drone deliveries and air taxis. We crunched the numbers. We saw how their strong financial performance is fueling their growth and their commitment to shareholder value. And we even got an expert perspective on the opportunities and challenges that lie ahead for this ambitious airline.
Yeah, and remember, this deep dive was just a quick glimpse into JAL's world.
Yeah.
If you're interested in learning more, I highly recommend checking out their full integrated report. It's packed with even more details and insights.
And if you enjoyed this deep dive, be sure to subscribe to the podcast so you don't miss out on future episodes.
Yeah.
We'll be tackling more fascinating companies, industries, and trends, all with the goal of making you a more informed and insightful thinker.
Until next time, keep exploring, keep learning, and keep asking those thought-provoking questions.
Thanks for joining us.